So this is an informal, kind of overview of the American role leading up to the Second World War and in the Second World War, kind of as an informal study guide for the American history push, the AP exam study guide, and it's just kind of a preliminary test to see if this sort of um, studying will work. And in this podcast, in this overview, I will be talking about the United States' role in leading up to the Second World War. The time period specifically would be 1933 to 1939, and well, let's just see how it works. So this era begins with um, a little person, a little guy, named FDR, and many of you may have known who this guy is. FDR, one of the greatest presidents in American history. Both liberals and conservatives alike consistently raise FDR as, you know, generally higher for liberals than conservatives, but definitely, um, undisputably, one of the top five or top three United States presidents. He led us through World War II. He was very excellent, a very pronounced statesman. And what he did during 1933 was something, he pursued a policy of kind of repair with the Latin American countries. It was called the Good Neighbor Policy. And again, it was in 1933, so the very beginning of this era. And what it stipulated was that no states had a right to, quote, intervene in the internal or external affairs of another, end quote. And so this essentially kind of eased over the former Platt amendments that were such an eyesore to many of the Latin Americans. Like, it rubbed them the wrong way. Like, who are you, the United States, to intervene in our affairs? National sovereignty. It's one of the many things it violates. Um, there was also the Monroe Doctrine. It was made by James Monroe, and it stipulated that no European nation had the right to intervene with Latin America because Latin America was under the United States' sphere of influence. And at this point, the United States wasn't quite a superpower. Um, World War II would actually temper the United States and turn it into a superpower, both world wars actually. Um, but enough about that. The United States was actually a great power at this time, meaning it had huge, political capital. It had diplomatic outreach, and it had the potential, not quite the military, but the potential for a military too. And as you would see in both world wars, but especially in World War II, the potential for a huge projected military, outreach. And FDR, being a liberal, enacted the Good Neighbor policy in hopes of repairing relations with um, the Latin Americans, and so the Latin Americans looked upon it, favorably. It returned. It would kind of set up the foundation of the returning of the Panama Canal to the Panamanians later on in history. I believe it was maybe in the 2000s, but that's not actually relevant to. It won't be asked on the AP exam. Um, Meanwhile, in Cuba at this time, it was also 1933, there was an economic crisis. There seemed to be a lot of those in world history, particularly U.S. history, but there was a leftist regime, And at this point of time, there was also the Red Scare. Many people typically associate the Red Scare with the 1960s, but there was also the kind of embers of, so to speak, of the Red Scare. And a leftist regime, a very liberal regime, rose in Cuba. It threatened Cuba, and so to speak, of course. And the United States, fearing this immensely, sent in Marines and provided, indirect aid to a conservative revolt that actually succeeded in overthrowing the radical government in 1934. And this interference in Cuban affairs, it would be kind of a theme that would go on and on throughout history. The infamous Cuban Missile Crisis would actually accumulate, in the Cuban Missile Crisis that for the first time in world history, threatened to annihilate the entire human race. And that's absolutely huge. And this would all just be centered on this little island, 90 or so miles off the coast of Florida. And the United States rationale for invading Cuba, or, at least interfering with Cuba, if indirectly, but definitely, playing an integral role in the self-determination of the Cuban state, was at best a security measure. If you look at the reasons behind it, and you were trying to justify the reasons behind the Cuban intervention, you would say that, well, since the Cuban, the island of Cuba, so close to the United States, if a leftist regime, which is completely, by the way, ideologically opposed to the American system at that time, and still is today, some would argue, if a leftist regime rose in Cuba, there would be huge consequences. We would just have an enemy at the gates, and so this provided the first, American interference with Cuba, and it would just make the Cubans, throughout all of history until now, perhaps, angry at the United States, angry that they didn't have the right to determine their own affairs. Recently, President Barack Obama actually normalized relations with Cuba for the first time since arguably 1933, and he actually took Cuba off the list, the infamous United States list of states that sponsored terror. North Korea was on this list until Clinton or someone took him off. And, he's just trying to normalize relations with this country that is right off our borders. And it's a very good idea considering, how, geographically, and not just that Cuba has, importance as a port, importance as a country that, grows crops, what we would call back then cash crops. Also, at this point, moving on, Mexico, the United States, and Great Britain, two imperialistic powers, nationalized the oil companies owned by their shareholders, and it kind of rubbed the Mexicans the wrong way, because at the same time there was this good neighbor policy, and a lot of Latin Americans saw this as contradictory. They were like, well, there is this good neighbor policy, and it's supposed to give us autonomy. It says clearly no state has the right to intervene, but here you are, the United States, the creator of this policy, and yet you and your ally Great Britain are actively nationalizing oil companies within our country. Today that wouldn't even be legal, but things were different back then. American exceptionalism, the sense that the manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to project this American influence, sphere of influence over all of Latin America. And after lengthy negotiations, there was a compensation agreement formed between the United States and Mexico. Ultimately, the legacy of the good neighbor policy did not end the United States' interference in Latin America, nor did it end the resentment of this quote-unquote rich Uncle Sam perception by Latin American countries, but it did better relations with Latin America, and this would prove useful in World War II and later the Cold War. And so across the ocean, meanwhile, in Italy they saw the rise of Benito Mussolini. Many of you know this guy. He was the staunch ally of Hitler. In fact, there was one moment later in World War II where he was captured by either Allied forces, right, Allied powers, the United States and Great Britain and France and Russia, and imprisoned on this fortress. It's almost something out of like a James Bond movie. Or he was imprisoned by the Democrats within the country, the Republicans, the people against his fascist regime. But either way, what Adolf Hitler did was he sent German elite commandos, kind of like the SS Waffen. And it was almost in this movie, this Hollywood-esque daring rescue, and he actually rescued Mussolini right under the noses of the Allied or Republicans. And what Benito Mussolini was reported to have said was, "Oh, I knew my friend wouldn't have forgotten me." And so, it just shows you the extent of the ideological, um, agreements between the ideological like similarities and staunch allyship of the Nazi regime and the Italian fascists. And what Mussolini did was he seized power in 1922 in Italy, and this was in a point of time where the world was kind of like starting to decline economically. It was a domino effect. It really did start with the United States. After the Roaring Twenties, it's almost like hubris in which the economic gods perhaps struck down the United States for their, the citizens, the Americans for their excess and want. And you can kind of see this in modernist works, denouncing this rampant abandonment of morals and just this mass consumption, indulgence, opulence, extravagance, excess. And then it all came crashing down with the Great Depression, with Black Friday, with the stock market crash. And this was in a point of time where, before that occurred, many people believed that democracies were the best form of government. It was indisputable. Democracies allowed for direct participation for the citizens, and most people liked that. And it was kind of as a given that democracies were the government that every developing nation or every undemocratic nation would eventually strive to become. So when the fascists rose to power, and there's this story where Mussolini and his black shirts, the equivalent of the SA in Germany, kind of like rivals of the SS, the brown shirts, something I always have to do with shirts, but the brown shirts in Germany, the black shirts in Italy rose to power, and it was said that the democratic parliament of Italy was so weak at that point, they were so weak-hearted, or either they believed so heavily in Mussolini's cause, the charismatic figure that was Mussolini, because they all seemed all fascist. They always have to have this charismatic figure. They either believed in him so much, or were so afraid of the black shirts' intimidation tactics, or possible violence, or violence against their family members, or whatnot. I mean, we weren't there, so we can't figure out the rationale behind what they did next. What they did next, they simply handed over the government. They simply handed over parliament to the black shirts and Mussolini. And this was incredible. Imagine a third party of the United States, a fascist third party of the United States, and they just seized power. And not only that, but they seized power in a way that meant the sitting United States government simply handed over the government to this extremist, this fascist, this ultra-nationalist third party. It's kind of like if the Tea Party suddenly just took the United States government, not by force, but just, the government just gave up. They're like, yeah, it's yours now. And so Mussolini declares himself as, kind of the next Roman emperor of Italy. And so, thus, the democratic government of Italy falls. And so, at this point, it isn't that big of news, because Italy wasn't really even a great power, even really a second-rate power at this point, and it never really would be. After the decline of the Roman Empire, you could argue that Italy's, involvement in the world stage was only kind of in a footnote at best, and it's a sad truth. But at the same time, they make these mistakes, such as this invasion.